One piece of obscure 2007 code that has propped up the entirety of the fan control and basically most of the RGB control industry. It's called WinRing 0. It's a driver. And this driver is used in a lot of software that controls hardware through Windows. But it's all break-in. If you're like us, you've always felt at least some sense of looming dread when you install a piece of software that controls fans or LEDs. There's something ominous about a clunky, half-baked, mostly broken UI that controls hardware that exists in meat space. As always, being pessimistic paid off. It's kind of an optimistic look at pessimism. It creates like a circle. But anyway, the point is, pessimism worked here. And the reason is, Height started sending out emails in early March, and The Verge later published a story about WinRing 0. And this topic came up because the driver was being flagged as a threat by Windows Defender, and it was starting to just break all the software that leverages it. And again, this is stuff that's built on 15-plus-year-old code in some instances. So this is the history of a piece of code that most of you probably didn't know exists. And if you did, shut up, and let's just go with the premise. Just work with me here. It's a better story this way. This is the story of WinRing 0. Before that, this video is brought to you by ID Cooling and the frozen A720 cooler. The A720 air cooler performed well in our testing last year. The A720 is a relatively high-end, dual 140mm air cooler with 7 heat pipes. We found the use of larger fans can be beneficial to acoustic performance given the thermals, although you'll want to check your case for compatibility given the taller nature of the cooler and its fans. ID Cooling uses an all-black look for its A720 and includes mounting hardware for all modern sockets. Learn more at the link in the description below. As to the fact that a multi-billion-dollar industry is being propped up by basically an abandoned piece of code from a then junior developer who has disowned it, that's an interesting story. And we need to start that story with the history. WinRing 0's creation brings us to its origins, where it was a library originally released in 2007 by Noriyuki Miyazaki, aka Hio. And he regrets it. The developer is best known for Crystal Disk Mark and Crystal Disk Info. According to the active GitHub repository, quote, WinRing 0 is a hardware access library for Windows, and, quote, WinRing 0 library allows x86-64 Windows applications to access I/O port, MSR, or model-specific register, and PCI, end quote. Basically, WinRing 0, the driver, is a unique open-source window into hardware. And over the years, it's become that XKCD comic manifestation for small developers who can't afford to develop and certify their own loopholes for controlling hardware, like RGB, LEDs, and fans. If you've been part of a small team or a solo developer, or in some cases, even some of the huge hardware manufacturers in the space, and you want to develop something to control hardware, and in particular, control things like fans or RGB LEDs, to control it through Windows, then WinRing 0 has been the go-to option. Hio announced the end of development in February 2010, stating in Japanese that, quote, WinRing 0 is essentially a library that should not exist. I wanted to share the joy of low-level programming with as many developers as possible, so I developed and released WinRing 0 after fully understanding the various issues. But I had no choice but to accept that this is no longer acceptable in today's age, end quote. He repeated that same sentiment to us in an email reply, saying that, quote, I consider it a complete youthful indiscretion on my part not to have accepted the changing times, end quote. The final update from Hio was WinRing 0 2.0.0 in July of 2010, at which point he intentionally removed almost all functionality, apologized again, and described the project, again in Japanese, as a, quote, big failure. And there's something really sad about that sentiment, because this is a solo developer who went out and built this project out of a love of working with lower level hardware and passing code through to it. So Hio, if you're watching, we don't think you should feel that way about it. And actually, in one aspect, for better or worse, WinRing 0, the driver, was actually a huge success because there's an entire industry that is propped up by it. And these are companies that are transacting hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue of computer hardware that have relied at some point or currently on WinRing 0. But maybe that's why Hio feels like it was a big failure. because there's so much reliance on it and because the developer himself views the software as a youthful indiscretion. Given what WinRing 0 is, a method of low-level access to hardware, it makes sense that Hio has distanced himself from the project so much, especially since he's currently collaborating with Microsoft. The releases of Windows Vista in 2007 and Windows 7 in 2009 made it increasingly clear that Microsoft is no longer in the business of just letting anybody f around with this stuff. Windows was moving away from low-level programming. The idea of old-school, unrestricted memory access is scandalous today. As Martin Malik of Hardware Info stated to The Verge, quote, "Since the driver has access and doesn't restrict the range, it can read or change other processes, secrets in memory, or protected kernel registers. This is very dangerous," end quote. And as Hio stated when closing WinRing 0 development 15 years ago, quote, "If you think about why the OS restricts access to I/O ports, physical memory, MSR, etc., and why signing kernel mode drivers is mandatory since Vista 64, you'll understand," end quote. We don't want to get into the weeds too much here, but kernel mode is the alternative to user mode. We'll let my good friend Wendell explain.
It's like Ring 0, Ring 1, what is the kernel? I've heard of, it's like the Linux kernel, but Windows has a kernel too. So the kernel is responsible for like your management of your system. So process management, memory management, hardware abstraction, security isolation, and system calls, which is like a programmer's calls. Like the kernel is going to provide this programmer's interface. It's like you call this as a programmer, and then the kernel goes off and does something. And so the buck stops here with the kernel. So your programs just run over here, and they don't have to deal with things like which processor am I running on? How do I allocate memory? It just says, I would like to allocate memory. And the kernel says, how much memory would you like? And then you get an address, and then that's all handled. Memory management, all the abstraction for all those kinds of things. So the kernel is really the smallest, lowest part of your operating system, and it is typically engineered to be as uncomplicated as possible. It's only as complex as necessary to do the task. And if it has bugs, that leads to a lot of problems, not just in terms of system instability, but also security issues and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's fun to think of it abstractly. It's like, okay, your computer is a bus, and all of the apps on the bus are the passengers. The kernel's the driver of the bus, and your computer hardware is like the engine and the wheels and the door and the brakes and that kind of thing. And so the driver gets to decide how to use everything safely and effectively. And if one of the passengers, figures out like Wet Willie's the driver, then that's bad. It's the driver that may put everybody in danger.
The only reason your analogy gets more confusing is because you're using the word driver to explain the operation of the vehicle.
And you're using the word bus to explain the vehicle. So
operator.
With that in mind, we can take some time to explain WinRing 0's namesake as another piece of its history and its security Ring 0.
There's a lot of Ring 0 drivers, as it turns out. Ring 0, kernel mode. I'm not a Windows developer for like day job, but like kernel operating system, like it kind of makes sense. The things that are close to the hardware are Ring 0, and they're supposed to have a relatively low surface area. If you are running an application and the application does something bad, that's Ring 3, I believe, the application crashes. If you're running something at Ring 0 and it crashes, it has the potential to affect the entire system. And so the entire system will crash. Windows blue screens, probably Ring 0. What has really accelerated the Microsoft giving the boot to Ring 0 is the CrowdStrike thing. Like, this has been a problem forever, but the CrowdStrike thing taking out, the vast majority of infrastructure that runs Windows and CrowdStrike, Microsoft sees as a problem. And so this is a casualty of war, basically. Ideally, you have things running in user mode Ring 3, all things running in user mode Ring 3. And so all of your software runs at Ring 3. And the driver is very small and very low level and very lightweight and doesn't need to run quite as low level as Ring 0, but it's still sort of in the administrative permissions mode. But at a very a low fundamental level, you can use software to update your BIOS, and that is a pre-boot environment. Like you can have malware that lives in your BIOS. I would prefer having a motherboard that has a jumper so that when I want to reflash the BIOS, I physically have to move a little switch to say yes.
Is this
And otherwise,
is this where we branch into ranting about Asus Armory Crate, or is that another time?
yeah, it goes the other way too. The BIOS could run arbitrary software.
Now, kernel mode drivers are almost always hardware device drivers, and within the x86 structure, these typically occupy the highest security ring alongside the kernel, Ring 0. This is why a device driver literally named WinRing 0 getting out to just anybody who wants it might be a little alarming to Microsoft, especially in the face of all of the malware and security concerns that it's had over the years, but in particular, back around the era that this was still being developed. And as confusing as it is, Wendell overall is still pretty positive on the basic concept of security rings. Here's why.
The Ring 0, Ring -1, Ring 1, it's very tightly coupled with hardware features of x86 to provide isolation, which is great. There's different approaches from AMD and Intel, but there is a hardware aspect of this that is very nice for users as well. So it's not just like you're entirely reliant on a 100% Microsoft software solution, but a lot of this is how Microsoft has chosen to implement the various security levels. But it dovetails with a lot of functionality that is at the hardware level, which is nice because the hardware is trying to protect you from, code that shouldn't be executed and blah, blah, blah.
And so we get to the next part of all this, which is digital signatures. Microsoft's method for mitigating those concerns has been to require digital signatures for kernel mode drivers in all Windows versions since 64-bit Vista. A digital signature is a certificate issued by a trusted certification authority, or a CA, that verifies, quote, the file or the collection of files is signed. The signer is trusted. The certification authority that authenticated the signer is trusted. The collection of files was not altered after it was published, end quote. Back when WinRing 0 was first published, individuals in Japan could sign drivers themselves, which Hio did. More expensive and difficult to obtain extended validation, or EV certificates, were required starting in the Windows 8 era, and they're only issued to businesses, but old drivers were grandfathered in. So over the years, when installing a piece of software, you might have seen some kind of pop-up about the driver signatory, the lack or the presence of a signature. And we see this a lot with the prototype versions of software where they haven't signed it yet, hasn't gone through all the processes. But as for why digital signatures are a useful idea in general,
as part of Microsoft's strategy to deal with this, like driver signing in general, any kind of signing, executable signing, is actually sort of fun and interesting. It's a fun and interesting way of approaching security. If you right-click on basically any executable on any modern Windows system and you look at the properties, you can see that the executable is digitally signed. This also goes, and that's an identity thing. It's like, this is from this company. Drivers are a great place to hide malware. And so it has to kind of be a walled garden. And so the certificates like you have on a website is really not a lot different, or the executables from programs is really not a lot different than what you have for a driver. It's basically you create the driver, you submit it to Microsoft. The submit it to Microsoft process doesn't actually technically have anything to do with signing, but theoretically, Microsoft looks at you as a company and says, okay, yes, we're going to be able to do business with you, and you get something that you can sign that is trusted. And it is the standard certificate signing process where here is my certificate. I'm going to send this somewhere that will then say, okay, yes, we are going to sign the certificate that you have asked for, except instead of being based on a hash for something ephemeral, it's based on the hash of the actual binary of the driver. And so this driver with this hash has been signed, and if somebody tampers with the driver or changes it, then the cryptographic signature will no longer match and the driver doesn't work anymore. And so it's a nice way to affirm that something has signed off on the contents of this driver, and this driver is good.
Wendell also interestingly pointed out that CAs can be broken into, and that certificates and certifications can actually be stolen, and they have been stolen in the past. But that's a story for another time. So Hio apologized for pulling the plug and for refusing to maintain WinRing 0's certification back in 2010, 15 years ago now, seemingly with the expectation that its certification would be pulled and that everyone's projects would break. Quote, WinRing 0 was discontinued without any alternative plan in order to avoid the worst case scenario of the signature being revoked. And quote, if the digital signature for WinRing 0 is revoked, all WinRing 0 based applications will be unable to start in an x64 environment, end quote. And that brings us to the second part of WinRing 0's interesting history. WinRing 0 actually became a foundational core part to many projects, like a lot of projects. And some of those projects, like Open Hardware Monitor, later forked as Libre Hardware Monitor, would themselves become foundational to even more software on top of that. So we've got nested layers of reliance on something that hasn't really been even maintained or even liked by its original developer for 15 years now. Seriously, you very likely have used software with some of this software in it that's actually core to its functionality. And with the changes that Microsoft is making for security reasons, a lot of that software is breaking or has broken or was changed to prevent it breaking. And all of that is for good reason, because over the years, Hio's concerns were repeatedly validated. In 2019, HP got into hot water for including WinRing 0 pre-installed in its HP Touchpoint Analytics service, pre-installed on most HP PCs, it said. This became a massive security concern from one of the biggest OEMs. In 2020, WinRing 0 was named in another CVE, or Common Vulnerability and Exposure, for EVGA's Precision X1 software. In 2021, it was Crucial's turn. Even though specific software was called out each time this happened, HP, EVGA, and Crucial were using the same 1.2.0 version of WinRing 0 that everyone else was. As German Isaac put it, quote, the driver was made in 2007, CVE in 2020. Microsoft started blocking it in 2025. Vulnerability has been around for 18 years, end quote. As for why Microsoft hasn't blocked it before now, according to OCCT, quote,
they haven't done it yet because big corporations were lazy enough to use it in their software in the past. So that would invalidate their own software, so they cannot do it right away.
And the list of software using this is huge. That means the attack vectors are everywhere. So EVGA Precision X1, Crucial Mod, HP Touchpoint Analytics, SignalRGB, OpenRGB, and many more are on that list. But the problem isn't that these solutions, including some versions of Afterburner, by the way, are compromised. The problem is that they use an insecure driver, WinRing 0, and that driver is then accessible to any other software that wants access to it that's on the computer. And that includes malware. This is precisely what happened with actual malware SteelFox starting in 2023. That vulnerability is real, and it's been actively exploited for profit. This isn't just some proof of concept. It's not hypothetical. It's an actual in-the-wild malware that has been used to illicitly make money. And so calling it, quote, theoretical, as CapFrameX did, is irresponsible and dangerous. And it's not really relevant whether the software that installs the driver itself is safe. To quote OCCT,
it's vulnerable as f.
And to quote Wendell, here's what he thought.
If you say the last time the driver was meaningfully updated was 2008 and it has not yet been exploited by malware,
Oh, it has.
then
It has.
oh, okay. Well, I was like, that's a miracle. But yeah, if it has, then there you go.
For another example of a Ring 0 problem, not WinRing 0, but the Windows actual security Ring 0 and problems that can happen related to it, take CrowdStrike.
So what happened was CrowdStrike has a Ring 0 malware detection driver. And CrowdStrike is otherwise very good software. It's very, very effective at what it does. It's an interesting security architecture. They made a mistake in their software. And as a result of the mistake, the system tried to jump to memory address 0 or start executing memory address 0. I don't really remember exactly what the details were, but it was something obviously incredibly stupid. And there was no safety rails for anything at this level, and so systems would crash. And it was an impossible situation because the system would boot and crash and boot and crash and boot and crash. And if you were lucky, after the 20th or 30th time it would do that, the system would notice and deal with it. And so Microsoft is saying, we got to get all these, this is the Wild West. We got to deal with this Ring 0 problem immediately. And things like software like CrowdStrike cannot run at Ring 0. We as operating system vendors have to provide a lower level facility to let these software vendors do what they need to do, but without compromising the integrity of an update process, without compromising the integrity of a boot process, to provide fallbacks and that sort of thing. And as a result of that, because, I mean, internally, Microsoft has known this is an issue almost since day one. They didn't care until millions of machines had very large problems. Basically, every CrowdStrike customer that got the update.
And in maybe a less serious way, beyond the current wave of Windows Defender pop-ups blocking or quarantining WinRing 0 and similar drivers, these types of drivers, like WinRing 0, also have a tendency to flag anti-cheat software, like easy anti-cheat. You can kind of come to your own conclusion on how serious you think that particular issue is. Could be serious. You could lose access to an account, I guess. But these are not false positives. They're real. There's an actual concern there. And the reason it gets flagged by stuff like easy anti-cheat is because of its ability to read and rewrite memory. And ultimately, it is therefore not a false positive. It's a true positive. As Hio stated 15 years ago, quote, although a general purpose hardware access library such as WinRing 0 1.x is very useful for prototyping, developers would need to develop dedicated device drivers for public release, end quote. But there needs to be a better and a secure solution to gain access to hardware and control it. And there is one, and there has been one. As a developer, the 100% by the books way to do this, as far as we understand it from talking to all these different people, is to develop your own dedicated driver for your own specific product and then go get it signed. This is apparently the path that EVGA took back in 2020 after that CVE we mentioned. New signatures for kernel mode drivers, though, are really only somewhat readily accessible to large companies. And so smaller companies with smaller development teams might be constrained by either just simply access to getting signatures or by money, recurring payments to maintain those signatures, maintain the software, and to develop the drivers to begin with. It's all expensive. And so that may be a restriction for smaller dev teams, which a lot of this software we've been talking about is run by. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting because EVGA comes back into the story. Somehow EVGA continues to pop up in ways that you wouldn't expect. And maybe the reason for that is now that without EVGA really being present anymore, you start to see the ripple of it leaving, or mostly leaving. And some other manufacturers, which include Height, have informed us that EVGA was somewhat propping up the fan control and the RGB software by getting signatures on the driver. Now, we've had a tough time trying to verify some of these claims, but that seems to be at least the belief held by, for example, Height. And WinRing 0, therefore, has been eternally recycled and has been also eternally frozen at the vulnerable version 1.2.0. If you dig around in Libre Hardware Monitor's source code, for example, it references WinRing 0 sys 1.2.0.5 from July of 2008. Again, we're back to the XKCD comic where some obscure piece of code from almost 20 years ago is still being used. But Libre Hardware Monitor using this version, 1.2.0.5, makes sense because Hio's next release included a reference in a patch note saying that, quote, it would have been an easy fix if only a digital signature could be obtained. But since the kernel mode driver cannot be updated, this was scrapped, end quote. According to Martin Malik of Hardware Info 64, this day of reckoning has been a long time coming, with Microsoft repeatedly warning that the driver would be blocked. And again, we've heard unconfirmed reports that EVGA possibly took up the maintenance of this driver and the signatures and certificates in the post-2010 era, where they possibly arranged for its renewal, because as we understand it, certificates expire with time. So it's also possible that EVGA just simply convinced Microsoft to not revoke it. If EVGA had any involvement, it probably ended in 2020 when the company stopped using WinRing 0, or at least in 2022 when the company basically halted operation. Microsoft's statement to The Verge that, quote, we are aware of reports about gaming and monitoring applications being flagged as a threat due to the use of unsigned versions of the WinRing 0 driver, end quote, implies that the driver is now unsigned, which could be a further clue that EVGA was doing some kind of upkeep behind the scenes. And so again, somehow we keep learning about EVGA's involvement beyond GPUs in this industry, which is a story we've told many times, but continues to be intriguing. Now, all of this is a problem because there are limited tools to access and modify your hardware and how it behaves. Again, fan control, RGB, overclocking, multipliers, voltage. There's limited tools for that to use through Windows, and there needs to be something for at least some of those. The limitations are for good reasons. It's for security. But currently, a lot of the tools that have relied on WinRing 0 or similarly vulnerable solutions are breaking or broken or functioning and insecure. And so that brings us to the next part, which is the future of WinRing 0. The easiest solution to all of this would be to patch WinRing 0 itself. After HioHio's last constructive contribution in 2009, Herman Semenov, aka German Isaac, took over maintenance. This was in 2019, initially with the goal of optimizing crypto mining, actually, with access to CPU MSR registers. As he stated to us, quote, around 2023, many people wanted to build WinRing 0 Windows driver themselves to increase mining hash rate, even though it was much more difficult than just mining on Linux, end quote. In a weird way then, maybe this was the crypto mining world's apology to gaming and enthusiast users for the whole GPU shortage things that kept happening. At least now it's AI's fault, not theirs. But contributing some form of hardware control through the OS, that's important, and that's something that mining was starting to take up. Development accelerated in 2023 as other members contributed to the project, adding x64 support and fixing some BSOD triggers in the old driver, blue screens of death. Eventually, the team applied patches to address the OpenCVE from 2020. Critically, this fork of WinRing 0 remained unsigned. Only the unoptimized, insecure version from 2008 had the valid signature vital to projects like Libre Hardware Monitor. And this is where Height stepped in. So when Height contacted us with this story about a month ago now, it informed us that its plan was to take the version of WinRing 0 from German Isaac and his team that's been getting maintained, submit it to Microsoft for signing, and then fork Libre Hardware Monitor to integrate the patched and signed driver that it would take through the process. And then at that point, Height, it says, would plan to take on the responsibility of the regular maintenance and payments to Microsoft, basically replacing EVGA's assumed role in this whole chain of events. The direct benefit is that Height's own software can continue to function, while the rest of the industry gets to keep using WinRing 0 and Libre Hardware Monitor without getting auto-quarantined by Windows Defender. German Isaac told us that, quote, these fixes restrict the use of the driver only to programs running with administrator rights, end quote. This is certainly safer, but as Martin Malik of Hardware Info warned The Verge, this just means that an app has to be run as admin before it can access the driver. And we asked Wendell about this, and specifically running things as admin and how much that might help.
That's probably not unreasonable.
Okay.
Short of Microsoft getting involved and offering a better solution, or somebody that is, that deep in the Microsoft kernel driver developer ecosystem, that's probably what it would take, is somebody that has very deep, intricate knowledge of the operating system and also knows what the operating system is capable of. As far as I know, you're on your own to implement a lot of the functionality that would be needed to do that. And so this driver is probably still your best hope to do that. And Microsoft probably doesn't want to adopt the driver, which would also be a reasonable outcome. And at the same time, Microsoft probably doesn't want to re-implement the functionality that's in the driver. But how this is usually done is you peel away the minimum functionality and you stuff that in your Ring 0 driver, and then you have all of the other stuff live somewhere else. And that Ring 0 driver, you trust not to be able to be manipulated to access memory it's not supposed to, or write to a bus address that it's not supposed to be able to.
So, as we understand it, and with Wendell's help here to understand it, it sounds like the idea that a combination of patches and signatures can fix sort of the root cause of the problem is arguably misguided. But we still weren't sure, so we contacted Frank Delatre of CPU-ID, or CPU-Z, and Hardware Monitor, who explained that CPU-ID has had similar difficulties with its own software. Quote, in order to fix the problems, we had to move a big part of the user code into the kernel code, in the unique goal of reducing exposure. We could do that because only our code uses our driver. But for a generic driver like WinRing 0, this was simply not possible, since its functions were used in a different context by the different application. To go further, this means that no replacement of WinRing 0 is possible, at least not with the same genericity that WinRing 0 provided until today. So in other words, and as simply as possible, the thing that makes WinRing 0, this driver from 15 plus years ago, so uniquely useful is also the thing that makes it dangerous. Now, German Isaac is literally the front man for the fixed version of WinRing 0. He told us that, quote, personally, I migrated to Linux and BSD systems because Windows has become really insecure, and as a Unix developer, such operating systems really seem convenient to me, end quote. He also openly asked that developers use the imp-out32 driver instead of WinRing 0, although we've seen other developers express concerns about that one as well. OCCT has also announced that it'll be providing a publicly available but closed source alternative to WinRing 0, and it's possible that other organizations will follow suit. And Wendell expressed that there are other big picture alternatives.
For sensors and fan speed, one way that you could solve this architecturally is to just move it to a USB controller. That's slightly more cost. Or if like Nuvoton or somebody wants to build in a USB client interface, then that's probably a marginal cost increase. I'm slightly surprised it hasn't gone in that direction, but I'm also slightly surprised because this is a problem for Windows Server in the context of like the system management bus, because Windows like servers need access to the system management bus, and kind of hilariously, you have the out-of-band management that also has access to the system management bus. So like servers have a whole other computer inside them that has access to the system management bus and the same controllers, and so you can use that computer within a computer to monitor the sensors. You could just not have that and plug it into USB in the case of client computers, as opposed to like I say, we put important things on the system management bus, and so like controlling CPU voltage, yeah, probably should be on the system management bus. Controlling fan speed, you could probably do that through USB, but when it's through USB, the chipset and other things probably are not able to control fan speed. And so you end up with a chipset that needs a system management bus, so low-level parts of the system can make those controls, but user overrides have to come through another path, like through USB or something that's low security. Or Microsoft can provide a reasonable facility that is reasonably locked down to access the system management bus facility.
And so that's the actually continuing story of how this small piece of 15-plus-year-old code from a solo developer has propped up an entire industry of software that accesses hardware. And again, it's from a developer who now, looking back, regards it as not only a mistake, but in his own words, a failure. Which again it's really sad to read that's the thought, but and we feel bad for Hio, who is now powerless to stop these massive companies from trying to use the thing that he long ago disowned and said was a youthful indiscretion in the development project. And so these big companies, they have to develop their own alternatives, and some of them are starting to. This includes groups like potentially Microsoft doing something at a Windows level to open this up, since clearly this is something people want. Maybe they can implement a more secure way to do it. Alternatively, companies like Razer or Height, or really everyone else involved, and it brings us back around to what power the user really has, if any, and what you need to know in this situation, the actual take-home knowledge. So our recommendation is to do what your antivirus software says, especially in regard to this one, because again, it's not a false positive, it's a true positive. This is a real potential vulnerability. And if Windows Defender quarantines WinRing 0, we'd say let it happen. If anyone tells you to ignore those warnings, then treat those people or those groups with extreme skepticism. Again, there are real vulnerabilities that have been used which can exploit your machine. Microsoft appears to have paused the ban as of this writing, but it's only a matter of time. If everything goes according to plan, though, the patched driver should be usable soon, thanks to Height in theory, at which point you can decide whether requiring admin privileges for access meets your personal standard for safety. For whatever it's worth, the Windows Dynamic Lighting RGB control feature continues to be developed, although it doesn't feel great to be railroaded into using it just because Microsoft bricked the alternatives. But again, it was for good reasons. And still, it's probably the right direction for Microsoft and for Windows.
Well, there is one aspect of this where Microsoft is doing the right thing, and that is RGB control. You know how in Windows 11 you can do RGB control directly in the operating system?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, Microsoft, no half measures here. Let's go the rest of the way and add some fan controls, or at least provide a programming interface. You don't have to give me a GUI for RGB control or fan control like you did with RGB control, but wherever that's plumbed in, go ahead and plumb in the other stuff. I mean, it's really not any more complicated than that.
And our thanks to the various developers who helped inform this piece, and of course, our thanks to Wendell. And just one more thing from him. Wendell, my last question is, what are all of the monitors behind you for?
I've got a lot I've got to monitor.
God damn it. That's gonna be how I close all of our calls. We've done that, I think, 3 times now. So keep it going. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, if you like this type of story into weird, obscure things that have been built in the industry and prop up a lot more than you might think, we've done a lot of these now. Check the channel for it. Subscribe for more. As always, you might like our coverage on Zhaoshen, the Chinese CPU maker and operating system maker that we covered years ago. You can search that on the channel for ZHAOXIN if you want to learn about that weird setup of hardware and software. But subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help fund our research. These take a long time to put together, and obviously that has a cost with it. So your support on the store directly helps us, and it gets you something cool in return, like our PC building anti-static mod mats with pinouts and screw tracking diagrams, our high heat-resistant silicone project and soldering mats that are super high quality and great for your projects, and more, like our copper-plated stainless steel mule mugs and our tabletop gaming dice sets. So you can grab that on store.gamersnexus.net to help fund our work, or go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to throw a few bucks our way. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.